So hello everyone, we're back with another episode of A Student's Perspective, and today we're talking with Alex Gilliam, founder of Public Workshop and co-founder of Tiny WPA. So Alex, would you like to give us a quick introduction just about yourself and where you are today?
Sure. I'm in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in West Philadelphia, in our community-focused design studio and workshop on Lancaster Avenue, a sort of struggling business corridor in West Philadelphia. And, we have what many people would call a makerspace, but it's really much closer to being the most open design and fabrication studio you can possibly imagine. So almost nowhere is there a space like this on a business corridor where you have big glass windows where people can come in and pick up a tool, get help with the project, help out with a project, just hang out, all pretty much for free. And it's sort of a wild and wonderful way of practicing design and being a good citizen.
I love being able to see within the workshop too. I think that gives everyone a good idea of kind of the environment that you're able to provide there, especially when you say
we're overflowing with benches right now.
Creative workspace in progress. I like it.
Yep.
So I'd like to start a little bit further back and know a little bit more about your schooling. So I believe you went to school a little bit farther away from your cohorts now. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder for half of my undergrad, and I went there to major in history. And I also went there to race my bike, let's be honest. They had the best cycling team in the country. And so I got about halfway through there and realized I was kind of done with writing papers, and took an architecture class, took two actually. And although I didn't really like the program, I did like the classes, and I loved the way that design allowed me to integrate so many of my interests, which are very broad. And by that time, I'd also pretty much finished my history degree. And so I transferred to the University of Virginia for architecture at the end of my second year. And they have what is really quite insane of a summer transfer studio where you are supposed to make up 2 years in one summer.
Oh, wow.
And that was kind of nuts. But yeah, I both loved it and hated it a little bit too. Hated it probably because the learning curve was so steep. And, although I think kind of wired for doing this type of work, everyone else was way far ahead of me in terms of like their drawing abilities and the fluidity of their design process, moving from model to sketch, etc. And I mean, Photoshop was just coming out then. This is ages ago. I'm way older than I look. So I actually, I love studio, but I really sort of struggled with it and realized that I needed to sort of back off. And so my last year there, I decided to do a studies major, pretty much an architectural studies major, and which allowed me a lot more flexibility to, look at different things and look at design a different way. And that was pretty great because it did give me a chance to start looking outside the bubble of studio a bit and to work with people like my friend Maurice Cox, who's the mayor of Charlottesville, the first Black mayor of Charlottesville, who's now the head of city planning in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
This gave me some space to think about things and really to learn a bit about myself, honestly, because that's kind of what I was struggling with. But when I graduated, I got a teaching fellowship in rural England, and it was at this boarding school in the middle of nowhere Jeremy Irons' son went to and stuff like that. And that was also sort of a hard year, mostly because I was in the middle of nowhere and England is really gray, and but it was also really wonderful because number one, I got to travel a lot, and they had an amazing art department at this high school, and so I really got to take the time to stop and learn how to draw. And that was sort of my way of traveling, and actually connecting with people when I would travel in Europe, was to go someplace and sit down and draw, and inevitably someone will come up and talk to you, and I was like, cool. I'm slightly socially awkward at times, and that was really kind of good. And then the other thing was that although I taught a variety of subjects, I got to teach architectural history.
Oh, great.
And realized I really love teaching architecture. At the same time, in London, there's an architect named Sir John Soane. Do you know who he is?
Yes, yeah.
Yep. So, I went to see a lot of architecture when I was in Europe, but London was the closest major city. And so whenever I'd go to London, I'd go visit his house, and it's a crazy place, right? And I think the way that he thought about design, and at least talked about it at that time, that design could be about story. And there are these crazy stories that he had created, myths of like the dead dog buried in the basement, and a fake monk who used to live there. I mean, total absurdity. But that design could have sort of literal poetry, but then his like play with light and depth and things like that were really incredible. But what was really sort of important, in going and visiting there each time, was at one point I got a book about him, and I was looking at the plans of his house, and he just kind of tinkered at his house over and over again, kind of like Frank Lloyd Wright tinkered at Taliesin and many other architects have in their own right. And his first houses were terrible. No sense whatsoever. And to see him evolve as an architect, even though it's very far from the style and aesthetics of architecture that I'm mostly interested in, to see that he just had to keep working at it, at that time for me was a really important thing. And I think that's part of becoming an adult, is learning to be a little bit forgiving, on yourself, and just learning how, well, I got to work a little bit harder. If I work a little bit harder and give myself a bit of a break at times too, then then I can do some pretty cool stuff. So after I left there, I liked teaching architecture so much. I was like, I want to keep doing this. And so Philadelphia at the time had one of the most robust design education, K-12 design education programs in the country. And one of my best friends from undergrad lived here. And so I moved here and moved in right across from the first modern prison in the world, Eastern State Penitentiary, and tried to get a job with what was then the Foundation for Architecture. And they had a program called Architecture and Education, where architects paired with teachers and taught in K-12 schools. And something felt kind of wrong, and I decided not to take the job, and they imploded 5 or 6 months later, because the foundation had just been, I don't know, I think they'd been overspending on their annual Beaux-Arts ball and hadn't been making enough money. But I still really love design. And at the same time, I also, when that job didn't work out, I got a job with an architecture firm that does nice corporate work. I mean, they do good corporate work. They're called Ballinger, and but they're a 200-person A&E office, and I have to say I'm embarrassed that I fell asleep at my desk the first week there, literally head down on the keyboard.
Wow.
And one of the principals woke me up. But somehow I think because, it was a pretty buttoned down architecture firm in a lot of ways, that kind of my personality and being different and being interested in different aspects of architecture, it didn't get me fired.
Yeah, okay.
But it was good because it allowed me to see what sort of real corporate architecture was like, and I didn't like that very much.
Yeah.
I made models for a year, which was cool. Got really good at that. But as my time there was wrapping up, Philadelphia was the host of the Millennium AIA conference. Mm-hmm. And I think this is true with most AIA conferences, but whatever the host city is, they have like a legacy project that they tried to do. And so that year, Philadelphia's AIA chapter decided to open a high school. One of the first in the country, after there's a school in Miami and a couple of other ones, but one of the first like 5 schools in the country for architecture and design. Yeah. And it was going to be a charter school, and it was one of the first charter schools in Pennsylvania. And at that point, really, charter schools are problematic in a lot of ways, but charter school law at that point was really set up for them to fail. Like, people wanted charter schools to fail. So like, you get your approval for opening the school in, I think, like April, and you had to have a school open by August, which is insane, like building rented, everything. Yeah. And they had no idea what they were doing, and it was an utter hot mess. They started all 400 and some students at once. The building wasn't complete. They didn't fully interview everyone. And there was a near riot, and they had to shut down the school for 2 weeks. As crazy as that was, the real thing that arose out of it is that I got to, at a relatively young age, step into a pretty big sort of level of responsibility, and eventually wrote the design curriculum for the school and was the head of the department, and used teaching design. Pretty much since the time I finished undergrad, I was using teaching design to continue to explore my own interests in design and to become a better designer. And so, I think just alone, like having to stand up in front of 30 students or 25 students and draw something really quickly, like, you get really good, right? And so, did that and found a fair amount of success, in doing that. It was cool to build a team and to build a department and around this mission, and to get national recognition for that, and to help others, understand how to do some aspects of that, and to see like bumps and student achievement and things like that. But at a certain point, it was sort of clear to me that I didn't think like I could do much more there. Right. If the school didn't make some shifts, and it didn't seem like that was going to happen. So at the same time, like, the educational model that we were pushing is really project-based learning, which in many ways is how you learn in architecture studio, right? Like,
say similar to university.
Right, like, and mostly architecture school, where everything is sort of flowing through, like, you learn about math, you learn about English, but it's all flowing through the lens of a singular project where you have to synthesize, right? And that's one of the higher levels of learning, is when you can synthesize stuff, right? And at the same, so that was pretty cool, like seeing that realized, but at the same time, I just had this suspicion that this sense that until we actually gave young people the opportunity to actually impact the world around them, to not have things be a simulation, that we weren't maximizing their opportunities for learning and empowerment and all the great stuff that everyone was shooting for. And the school was half a block from Independence Hall, and there were some theories, which were actually sort of problematic in a way, about what, bringing students downtown, to see, like, being around these buildings, if that would have a positive impact. It may or may not have. It was cool to be able to walk out and, do a drawing lesson or talk about space and scale right there with a William Strickland building or what have you. But it didn't feel like a space could be theirs. And which is kind of surprising because like if I was at the skill level that I'm at now, you know, we could have built out the school, right? And that would have been completely radical in terms of engaging and putting students at the center of creating their own learning. So anyway, I got a fellowship at the Rural Studio, and moved to rural Alabama and lived on 40 acres by myself with coyotes and an armadillo that would come and hump the wall outside my bedroom every night, and wild, you know, Africanized bees, stuff like that. And, you know, so there I went down there with the idea that, you know, this idea that I just talked about where, you know, how can you maximize process? How can you find opportunities in the built environment where young people can make a contribution, like that if we maximize how we design buildings and make spaces, that maybe we could do more. And so I was kind of going down there honestly with a slightly critical eye at how the Rural Studio was functioning.
Yeah.
They were doing amazing stuff, but just I guess you could say I'm an optimalist. You know, in the sense that like I'm really interested in human performance, and it's always, without being negative, like, okay, how can we do a little bit better? How can we do more? And so this was not too long after Sambo Mockbee died. He's the founder of the Rural Studio. And he had created this fellowship program to bring in people potentially outside the profession of architecture who had been looking at architecture very different ways, and to include them in this mix, which was, you know, pretty much a very intensive studio isolated in the middle of a bunch of deep poverty and fields. And so anyway, they were building this fire station in New Bern, which is this tiny town where the Rural Studio is based, like 200 people. And it was the first public building that had been built in 100 years. And it struck me that, like, wow, you know, if you have this really racially divided community, the only road, like the main road is the public road, that's where it's being built on, it's highly visible. Wouldn't it be something like, you know, if young people actually got a chance to help make that? And if you use that visibility, like, what would happen there? Would that be a positive thing? Would that be a negative thing? And so unfortunately, like, I did get some support to do that, but you know how design build might go. It, like, everything is behind, and it was one of the bigger buildings that had been built at the Rural Studio at that point. So that was taking longer, than the weather had been bad. So it took them a long time to get into the ground to the point where students could really help. And at least initially, it was only going to be able to be helping on a larger scale around, you know, building and stuff like that. So it, you know, by April, as my fellowship was winding down, like, all of a sudden we're able to build, and people are like, oh, I get this. But in the process of recruiting, like, I had to go out and recruit these students, and I went to their school, which is called the Sunshine School, which is in the middle of a field, in the middle of nowhere. I think there were 500 kids, 10 acres, and one janitor.
Oh my God.
You know, for this entire school, K-12. And the building communicated to them, the condition of the building communicated to them that no one on the state, federal, local level cared. They were embarrassed to go there. One kid had tried to burn it down. They wouldn't mention its name in public, you know, sort of thing. And so in going to recruit students there, I really began to understand that my real project was supporting students and making changes they wanted at that building. And you know, had been thinking a lot about, while I was at this high school in Philadelphia, about, you know, how do you get more people into teaching? How do you get more designers who think they want to teach, like, into that, when it's a pretty hard thing? It's a pretty great leap. And so I've been thinking a lot about, like, well, just how do you create situations where people can be who they are and you're not asking them to be something else. Like, how does a designer get to be a designer and work with a young person? So I created this really simple process that empowered students to identify the things they liked and didn't like, the things that were broken, that they wanted to fix, the things that they loved in the school, and repeated that process over and over again with every class, and then helped them prioritize like what they should do first to get the most impact and stuff like that. And then we went out and did them. And that meant knocking down derelict buildings, replacing windows, repainting 37 doors, fixing the bleachers, creating a sort of a mural branding system, and stuff like that. And one day, mid-March, I went down to the school and I was feeling kind of down because we hadn't really gotten to that big D design, that is the rural studio. And I just was thinking, man, because we haven't gotten to that, we haven't achieved what we can. And I walk into the gym one morning, Thursday morning, and all of a sudden, all these middle school kids come running across the gym. Like 50 kids come running across the gym asking me if they could help. And at that point, literally on that day, I had, I think, 20 other students working on stuff around the school, and I didn't really have anything left for people to do at that point on that given day. And there were these two middle school girls who kept badgering me, as middle school girls are wont to do. They're like, come on, we want to help, Mr. Gilliam. And fully expecting them to blow me off. At a certain point, I was just like, well, look, I have this paint scraper here, and there's some paint that's peeling off the walls over there. It needs scraping. And they're like, paint, we love to scrape paint. And they took the 5-in-1 and they went over and they started scraping. And between that experience and some others at the school, it started to become clear that those 37 doors, those repainted railings, the fixed roof, that stuff was really starting to do something. And it wasn't necessarily design as we think of it, right? But it was design. It's absolutely design. And so really from that point forward, I resolved that, you know what, never again going to do a simulation. I'm never going to be like, let's imagine our future city, or let's design our dream home. Nonsense. Where are those opportunities in cities, the making of our cities and towns, where young people in their communities can have a legitimate impact in the design and making of those spaces, not, pandering to them, but where can they really make a difference? Because most people, what I realize is in rural Alabama is that we as adults lack the imagination to think that any of them wanted to do anything about that broken locker, right? That they wanted to help, and that could be actually, while there were sort of deep issues surrounding structural racism and whatnot that led to some of those circumstances, and that's sort of problematic in and of itself. The fact that broken locker could be a legitimate transformative learning opportunity for someone. We just don't have the imagination. We didn't have the imagination to understand that could be the case. So from then on, it was like, all right, where do we find these opportunities? What are they? And so at that point, I realized I really had to build my experiences to be able to realize the practice that I wanted to have. And I knew it was going to be like that. But I was also pretty aware that I didn't have a lot of the skills. I didn't know how to build well enough. So immediately after there, I went and lived with my parents in my parents' basement for a year, and worked with mountain men carpenters and got called boy a lot and swept a lot of sawdust.
And where was that located?
That was in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Oh, okay.
But not only did I learn how to build, but I really got to see firsthand how architects interact with builders and where there were inefficiencies in process, and how people were making space and buildings. And, a simple example was that I very distinctly remember a very good architect coming in multiple times over the span of a couple weeks with ever-changing pocket door details for this one bedroom. And I can't imagine how much he was billing for that, right? Thousands of dollars for pocket door details. All he really had to do was give old school Kenny, like the lead carpenter, a sketch, tell him what he wanted, or have Kenny do a mock-up. Kenny would have been he would have saved thousands of dollars and really respected like the labor, and it would have been much more efficient, and you could have then put that money elsewhere in the building. So I got to see a lot of stuff like that, which was really, really helpful. Then I went and all right, I want to learn about concrete. So I briefly apprenticed with a concrete countermaker. Then I moved to New York to partially be with an ex-girlfriend, now ex-girlfriend. But also to be able to work with some organizations that I knew were there that were about expanding another part of my skill set, or where I actually thought that I had the skills to plug in immediately and would grow in a different way, but also be able to help them grow. So I worked on one hand for the Hester Street Collaborative. I was like the first real employee aside from the ED, the Hester Street Collaborative, and helped them create some programming there. And at the same time, I worked for a real asshole metal fabricator, which was good. I got fired from my first job working with a cabinet maker. Just continued to build up those different experiences that I knew that I couldn't get in one place. And that just sort of, I think the key thing I would want to share there and reiterate again is I realized I couldn't get all of my experiences in one place, and that I had to go and build the pieces of that. But at the same time, I was doing things that I was very competent at, working for the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum and the Center for Urban Pedagogy, and indirectly the Municipal Arts Society. All of those were well within my wheelhouse, where I was already a legitimate kind of national expert, but doing those other things on the side that were uncomfortable. They were really uncomfortable. And it, just to be clear, my parents were kind of freaking out the year that I was a carpenter there, earning very little money, and is he moving forward? But just sticking to that and knowing that I had to do that to get where I am today. That was super important. And then, after doing all those things in New York, it's okay, I've really got most everything I need. And I love this sort of work. But, just because something is designed in a participatory manner, is made with rather than for, it shouldn't look like crap. It doesn't have to look like crap, right? There is unfortunately a visual language of what participation and engagement looks like that is partially formed sometimes by lack of resources, but also a lack of imagination, and also a lack of understanding of how people can create and contribute. So my last sort of piece in the puzzle was, wow, well-designed things that make a difference in a place, that are designed with rather than for, where there's rich learning, community building, equity building. Those things shouldn't be mutually exclusive. And at that point, everything, I'd sort of assembled all the pieces except for the design portion. And even though I'd been designing a lot, in those intervening years from undergrad, I knew I needed to spend some really focused time. And so I applied to grad school and went to the University of Texas for architecture. Frankly, it was the least imperfect degree. I I was looking at three different possible sort of directions, all to kind of accomplish the same thing. One was getting a master's of architecture. The other was getting a master's of industrial design. The other was going through an education school program, but with like a PhD where I would have the flexibility to focus on design. And each had its various strengths.
How different was that from your undergrad, especially through all that experience?
How different was going to grad school?
Yeah.
Pretty radical. Yeah. I mean, I knew what I wanted, and I also knew for the most part how it worked.
Right.
And honestly, like after I had left the rural studio, I also like went and got tested for ADHD and found out that I was like ADHD through the roof. And that just helped me really zero in on my process and how I needed to create and conduct my day to be successful, and how I needed to build off my strengths and sort of accept my weaknesses, if you will. So when I hit grad school, it was exponentially easier and joyful. But I think one of the key differences was just the level of advocacy for myself. It's like, I'm paying for this. And it was a little bit of a problem having had so much teaching experience, because I generally find that even in the best circumstances, like half of your university classes are crap in terms of the way they're taught.
Yeah.
So, and that's, I mean, I'm not trying to slam universities here, but there's often not a focus on the quality of teaching, or growing a quality of teaching, a high level of teaching. So that was a little bit tough at times, but I think having the confidence to carve out my own spot within that, and just know that, like, all right, I got to make the best of this. How am I going to do it? And so that, I think that time to think, to not only grow as a designer. I mean, it's kind of interesting because by then AutoCAD and SketchUp had come out. SketchUp had come out not too long before that, but very quickly, like, that allowed me to create at a speed, like a very fluid speed that matched like how fast my brain was moving, that I struggled to do in undergrad without digital tools. But being able to really fluidly move between AutoCAD, SketchUp, sketching, and modeling was a really sort of powerful kind of revelation. And then having the space to research the things I wanted to research, and find professors who were interested in that, and departments way outside of architecture, like in developmental psychology and stuff like that. And I got a travel fellowship, which was really essential. And I think that time, at least the research that I did during that time about cities and about people, I'm still seeing dividends from that to this day. I have mixed feelings about higher ed, but I think that I have to honor that was really important.
I consider a lot of your travels being so important to your process too, especially the amount of places you've had to go. Now being in Philly, I mean, I know this is a jump here, and talking about Philadelphia and what you've been able to grow there as like a national model for several communities. What's it like growing so close to Philadelphia and having it become so close to you as a person after having experienced all these places for probably long periods of time?
Yeah, I mean, so I started Public Workshop in 2009, and that, I knew I wanted to start my own thing. But as I was sort of graduating, I was asked to speak at this like citywide conference on public space. And I gave a presentation about pretty much citizens taking control of their cities and designing from the bottom up, right? And taking risks and doing things without permission and stuff like that. And it was the most surreal thing. Like, it was probably one of the best presentations I've ever given, but I had planners, I had people like up on their feet, like catcalling. They were I had people coming up to me from months afterwards, like planners in the city, saying like, "You give me hope," and I'm like, "Oh my god." But I realized kind of at that moment that like looking at the city a different way, and how the making of our cities, challenging the way our cities are made, was something that I needed to explore and that I could potentially make a business around. And so I started Public Workshop. The problem is at that time was there was no such thing as, no name for placemaking. The maker movement was nascent at best, and like I had to travel. I pretty much had to follow the work. Most people recommended that I start a nonprofit, but because none of those fields really existed and everything was still pretty siloed professionally, through sort of till the middle of the recession, the end of the recession, there was not grant money that was available to easily start a nonprofit. It would have taken more than the traditional 3 years. And so I had to travel all around the country and follow the work. And so I would go and live places for 8 months, 3 months at a time, and sleep on sofas and be incredibly grateful to girlfriends and relatives and stuff like that. But it was hard in some ways to be a lot of different places. And at one point, I think one Christmas I had stuff in 3 cities and I couldn't find everything and I was about to lose my mind, but at the same time, I think, foundational to all of that work, and even now, like being comfortable with being uncomfortable in a place where either you're different or you haven't been there before, you don't know the culture, there might be deep mistrust, any sorts of those things, like that is really important. And having been willing to be, getting called boy by mountain men carpenters, after having been like nationally recognized at a skill level, like that was really important. And that does underpin like one of those key ideas that we have in our practice, which is called learning to be strong and wrong. And so like like in regards to traveling, I've been to Arizona and Wisconsin, and I've been to Taipei, and I've been all over the place, and that's been really amazing. And I think the cool thing, before I actually answer your question, is simply to say that, one of the striking things is that in this moment of ridiculous polarization, it didn't matter where I was and who I was working with. Like everyone at the core, they wanted to build. Like it's sort of this innate thing, like building and taking action is all people want. Like building and design is control. And so in those travels, that's where that idea of like tiny WPA, like even small things can be really powerful levers in a community, in a learning process, in a design process. So, after a certain point, like Philadelphia, even while I was still planning on traveling, Philadelphia, I kind of realized was the place that I wanted to come back to. When I left it in 2003, I guess, one of the reasons why it also left was because I just felt like everything was really siloed. Like the industrial designers weren't acknowledging the architects, and the architects weren't acknowledging the interior design. It's just like, it was ridiculous. No one wanted to work together. And the recession and other things sort of tore that apart. And through some great efforts of friends who started in Philly, who started to try to connect different disciplines, it felt like a great place to be. At the same time, it was important, knowing that a lot of our work breaks rules. It was important to be in a place where there was enough space to take chances, where we could do things with our clients and partners and prove that it was possible without permission sometimes, but that it wasn't a place where we could do anything. Like there are times where we have to sit down and work with policymakers to change a policy or to get permission. Learning to balance those off, to work in both those scenarios, was to me, that was much more typical of a national condition, like learning how to work in those two circumstances. You know, Philly has huge challenges, like those 40,000 vacant lots are a huge challenge. It's also a huge opportunity, a broken school system, et cetera. Um, so this was the place to do that work. And then over the past couple years, you know, while doing some of these traveling projects, by almost any indication, you know, they were successes, but by my own metrics of knowing what is possible and how much we can, like we as designers or policymakers or educators, how much more we should expect from process, like the design process, and how much more we can get out of it by thinking differently about it. Mm-hmm. The impact that we can have. You know, some of those projects were just kind of frustrating. It's like I'm married now. I have we have a beautiful son who's 3.5 years old, and so between like being away from him and my wife at, you know, 2 weeks at a time, sometimes longer, as well as going into these, you know, working on these projects, which are incredibly intense, and they're intense. The intensity is joyful, but you're working like a 90-hour week to really make a lot happen in a very short period of time. And it just wasn't, it's like, if something goes off the rails, it's very hard to fix it. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, especially given, you know, the current moment, a lot of these sort of intractable policy issues, seemingly intractable issues around race or broken education systems or any number of things, like those are not going to be changed by a consultant. Yeah. And these are issues that are a lifetime's worth of work, and you have to be able to leverage every single connection you can to be able to move the dial on those issues. And so, you know, Tiny WPA, we created it actually to support the individuals who were coming up in these, you know, these design build projects. Like our fundamental method is designing and building in public. Yeah. Like we move the design studio to the sidewalk. We move it to, you know, we move the workshop, the design studio, the community meeting to the sidewalk, and we're working with a stakeholder group, you know, at the most heavily trafficked times a day. Anyone can come up and pick up a tool and help out, tell you your idea is terrible, give you a better idea, or bring someone else along. And it is an incredibly joyful way of working. And what we were finding is that people were, you know, coming up and getting involved who were not part of the original, like we're never going into a community that's not our own and saying who wants to do something. We're always invited in. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the reasons for starting a for-profit, was to, and doing this work in a for-profit fashion, was to, like when you're a nonprofit, you sometimes usually hold the money. Mm-hmm. In a for-profit setting, I was leveraging my national visibility to help other people get grants. Yeah. So at the very least, if the project was even a failure, like we strengthened their grant making record by co-writing grants with them. But anyway, the individuals who'd walk up and get involved in a project were often not the ones that we started off with. And by the end of a project, we'd have all these individuals who wanted to keep building. And again, one of the reasons for doing it as a for-profit initially was to say, like, look, there needs to be an on-the-ground partner there that can support the amazing things that could potentially happen in this. Like, it's really irresponsible to go in and say, hey, look at all you can do after decades of disinvestment and mistrust and broken promises, and then to leave, right? So by being a for-profit, it meant that we had to have a client and that there was someone on the ground there. Mm-hmm. But insofar as Philly was concerned, it's like, wow, you know, maybe we can leverage those individuals who are growing out of this. Not only can we support them to then organically go back and have more impact in their communities to realize the things they want to realize, but we can also start to bring those individuals together and create this sort of culture of greatness where we're then able to realize more work to support the demand for this work. And so that was when we kind of looked around nationally and saw that no one, like, we prototyped most everything we have done, from our cardboard builded discs to tiny WPA to the Building Hero project, etc., to chocolate cake master planning, like under public workshop. But realized that no one was pulling off like the workforce development training that is the Building Hero project in a for-profit setting. And so we created initially Tiny WPA to support that. Anyway, fast forward to now, and between having a kid and the impact that we want to have and the types of relationships, like family in the larger sense, like our Building Heroes are my family. The organizations that we work with, those, like, I'm a people person, and being able, like, I made great friends across the United States, who I miss very much, and around the world, but being able to work with these people and continually work with these people, and then, you know, you have their back and they have your back, and you're just constantly trying to raise the bar on stuff and figure out what's possible. That really demands being in one place. And so, yeah, as of last fall, we were able to get funding that allowed me to fully transition to being full-time with Tiny WPA, and pretty much solely be in Philadelphia, except for, you know, maybe a speaking engagement here or there, stuff like that.
So I have another, I guess, I don't know if this is a broader question or not, but
Sure.
in regards to COVID, I know there's, I guess, some changes in terms of design build scenarios and how that could affect some of the interactive kind of installations that could happen. What has been your approach to that yet? Or have you seen any changes, or has it created a halt in any sort of processes?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. Because fundamentally, like, number one, if you, one reason you see a lot of different stuff in here is that another aspect, a fundamental aspect of our approach is that we design and prototype at full scale, like 85% of the time.
Right.
So that means that, like, we don't draw that much. We definitely don't draw when we're working with a client or a partner. We draw at full scale. So everyone makes better decisions when they're at full scale. And, you know, drawing is one of those things that is divisive. There's a genius of factors associated with it, but everyone likes to build. And building is very, like, it's one of, like, building things, banging on things, biting things, and knocking things down, and doing that again and again and again. That is, like, the second most important way that we all started off learning about the world.
Yeah.
And so our design process very much is play, and it's iterating over and over and over again, and doing what we call making things real, like acting out scenarios, making things the right scale, like making, you know, like, you're making a bedside table, you have all the items you want to put on that bedside table, and that, like, starting with, there's very real constraints to design. If we're designing this public space, like, all right, how many people are going to sit in this area? All right, let's all sit in this area. How are you going to sit? You know, are you going to be sitting next to one another? Are you going to be, like, sitting shoulder to shoulder is one conversation, sitting, you know, at 30 degrees is one type of conversation, sitting face to face is another conversation. Each of those has very different spatial implications. So we have not been able to do a lot of that. And we have this, like, build your own public space toolkit that we've been rolling out, and, you know, that hasn't been able to be that participatory in terms of its development. We were very lucky, like, we never really fully shut down. We switched to making PPE, so face shields, you know, at I guess sort of March through now. But then when we got to yellow, we brought back in our some of our core Building Heroes, ages 16 to 23, and started fabricating and designing again in the shop. And man, that's probably one of the few things that's kept us sane.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so we've limited, one of the things that we do is every Wednesday in non-COVID times, we have a thing called Stop By and Build, and anyone can come in and pick up a tool, help out, etc. And so we typically on a Wednesday from 4 to 7 would have 15 to 45, 5 to 75-year-olds in here working on stuff. We don't have permission forms. There are no waivers. Like you can come in. I'll get you on the chop saw in 5 minutes. But we can't do that. And it was pretty heartbreaking that within a week of having to close the space to the public, like one of our biggest groups of people who are coming in for Stop By and Build this over the past year have been grandmothers and from the neighborhood. And we had to say, I'm sorry. And they're calling us like week in and week out after shutdown. I'm like, dude, you're the highest risk factor. Are you kidding me? And we don't have a big enough space to manage that yet. So that's been just kind of heartbreaking. I think it's been all of it's been a little heartbreaking because we talk a lot about the value of building. We will often use building in a process where the end goal is not building, because building feels good. It actually, it activates the dopamine system. It releases chemicals that are fundamental building blocks of a sense of connection between people, a sense of well-being. I mean, we've seen people who are struggling with drug addiction become cleaner because they're replacing those chemicals with natural chemicals. Anyway, we talk about how building all the time can be used as this method of healing, and people desperately need this right now. And we just haven't been able to really do that. We did start doing our first community builds for this build your own toolkit that we've been developing, which has been in response, ever since we moved into our workshop about 5 years ago. We had neighbors come in and say, hey, can you make a picnic table for us? Can you make a shade structure, because we give out free lunches to kids in the summer on this lot that we've taken ownership of. And because we just really bootstrapped Tiny WPA, because we were doing Stop By and Build for the longest time with no funding, for free, and pretty much writing off a bunch of staff and building heroes for doing that. It was really hard for us to be able to volunteer on something else. So eventually we got funding to be able to develop this toolkit and to support our neighbors. And we sort of interviewed around 100 neighbors, continue to interview people around the spaces that are important to them in the neighborhood. And it ranges from under-supported recreation centers to vacant lots that families have taken ownership when no one else has, etc. Community gardens, mapped all of those things, identified the top 20 things each of those sites needs, and then reduced that to about 8 different amenities. And then designed, sort of wrapping up the design of those amenities so that we can do more, hit more sites and have more of an impact, rather than designing everything from scratch every time. And we've seen just time and time again, a lot of times designers make this big mistake of going in and being, when they're working with a client, being what can you imagine this would be? And, and what do you want to happen here? And, what we fail to recognize a lot of times, especially in communities that have been repeatedly crapped on, or have experienced some degree of trauma, is that imagining that sort of thing is incredibly scary. But the fact of the matter is we all have stuff we're scared to imagine, and we just don't realize, imagination for us seems like a joyous thing, right? But imagination for most of the communities that we work in is a dangerous and scary thing, because they've imagined in the past and none of that's been realized. So one of our other tactics is you go in and you just start with need. And so we'll start with something really simple, oh, you need a place to sit. All right. We're not going to overthink this. We're going to come back and we're going to make a place to sit. And in the process of making that place to sit together, we will have started to form a team. We'll started to have, like, just like, did you ever read Alberti? Did you have to read Alberti's treatises? Like in one of his treatises, he pretty much was like, the client's terrible.
Oh.
Never visit the site. Don't talk to the client.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that like really, that I think that permeates the design profession to this day.
Yeah.
And, we see, like, we like people, and we see design as being like, with is always better than for. It's like, it's way more fun. And, we've developed these methods to create together. But, pretty much we think that you're going to be able to create better designs and have more impact the more time you spend on site. And so just by doing something really simple, at first, and not asking people to imagine and leap, and just responding to basic needs that no one has responded to in a long time, sets you up to you spend more time on site, you start learning about site conditions and how things are used, but you build a group of people around you, and you build a conversation. Like, building is this conversation, and then you can start opening the door a little bit and start really refining around, like, what's the problem, what's the real need.
Yeah.
So it's possible to do that. And, in Philly, given Philly is unfortunately fallen to the 6th largest city in the country, but it's a pretty, from 5th, damn you, Phoenix. But it's way easier to get around than Phoenix. It's a fairly accessible city. And there's some joy in that. It certainly makes a lot of the work that we do easier.
So you've hit a lot of good points. I especially like that you're able to touch on game or play in general as a terms of design process. And I think it's interesting just because I started discussing that for the first time in my whole collegiate kind of academic career of 6 years. We talked about play, and we did a whole semester on game and play, but it was all in the terms of interior architecture conditions and how we can consider it differently. And just play as a mindset for your daily activities, I think, is a beautiful thing to consider. And it just makes designing not only more fun and enjoyable, but it allows for a lot of experience to come out of it. So we are running a little bit out of time, but I would like to just end on another question for you. And I think in regards to the people you work with, just because you work with such a diverse amount and age gap of people, what's it like working with people from 15 years old to 50 and older?
Oh, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, we're certainly largely thought of as primarily working with teenagers and young adults, but we do work with all ages. And young people are amazing because they'll tell it to you like it is. They have no hesitation about that. That's certainly, like, working with young people initially really helped me become an infinitely better designer, because I knew very quickly whether I was being effective or not and how I talked about design. And that slapped me out of the BS language and way that we are taught in design school to talk about design and connect with others, which is utterly ridiculous. Like, design is incredibly human. I mean, our language systems as an interior designer, like, literally people's language systems grow out of their sense of home and place. And so when you start getting into things like aesthetics, and as soon as you get into aesthetics, a lot of times you've lost if you go there first, because you are potentially attacking their sense of self. So, like, just a lot of our process again is talking about space and use first, and we like aesthetics is like very much at the end, but having that privilege of working with young people to figure out what I was doing right and wrong was really helpful. And they're just not like, an adult's going to keep their mouth shut and talk under their breath or scream at you. Right. And old people are about the same way they're almost the same as teens in terms of what they'll, how they'll treat you and how upfront they are with you. But there's this great joy in working with that spectrum of people, and also just integrating that into our practice and not having it be a side thing. And I think that was a key realization at a certain point, was like, how do I not have this work with this broad age and socioeconomic range of people, like, why should that be on the side? Why should that be separate from practice? And then how does that become the core of your practice? It's incredibly joyful. I mean, one of my favorite times is, like after school on I guess today we're at an after school type of hour, although school's not really happening, but we're all like, there might be 3 or 4 of us sitting around and, like 3 young adults, and we're trying to fabricate or design something for a contract fab job at a really high level of quality. And I have this sort of metric of collaboration. Like, one of these metrics of collaboration is like when you can start talking crap about someone's mom and it doesn't end up in a fight. You've gotten a pretty good point. And so, like, sitting around the table, like talking smack about each other, trying to push each other to do their very best, talking very honestly, but having a lot of fun, and legitimately turning out, pretty awesome stuff. Man, it doesn't get any better than that. So there's some inefficiencies at times, but I mean, that's a continually evolving thing. But it's certainly, it's beneficial on the back end. Yeah. Wouldn't have it any other way, put it that way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you basically covered everything that I needed to in only a few series of questions, so it's impressive. But I'm sure there's a lot more to say. But that's good enough for us.
No problem.
I know everyone would probably love to find you on social media, website or social media. What's best?
Sure. The best things to go to now are Tiny WPA. Most of public workshop stuff is either out of date or we're winding it down. So, I mean, certainly you can go on @public workshops Instagram account and dig back through years and see some pretty cool public space design build projects and things like that. But otherwise, @tinywpa on Instagram. We're primarily on Instagram, and then www.tinywpa.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. And I hope that we can do it again and maybe make a visit down to Philadelphia as well when times are maybe of normal for all of us, but
we'd love to have you.
Reality.
We'd love to have you. You're welcome.
And thank you guys for watching another episode of A Student's Perspective.